Single mom dropped her locket. "Oh no, 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 what? That's my brother's face," said the Mafia boss. I wiped down table number 6 for the 3rd time that evening, the acrid sting of vinegar from the cleaning solution curling up into my nose with every motion. The clock hanging crookedly above the kitchen door read 5 minutes to 10, and the little roadside diner on the outskirts of Flagstaff had begun to slip into that strange, hollow state my coworker Kayla liked to call the ghost shift. Those quiet November nights, when our regulars all seemed to vanish at once, as if they had made some silent pact to stay home without warning. In a space that could seat as many as 40, only 4 tables were occupied, and most of those guests were nearly finished with their meals. "You trying to scrub a hole through the table?" Kayla's voice came from beside me, teasing but tinged with fatigue. She carried a pot of coffee in one hand, her other hand glued to her phone. Her blonde hair had slipped out of its tie, wisps falling across her forehead like fine mist in the flicker of tired fluorescent lights. "Seriously, Maggie, the table's clean. It's been clean since the 3rd time you wiped it." I set the rag down and noticed my hand was trembling ever so slightly. 3 years working here, and still I hadn't learned how to stay calm on nights like this. The quiet had a way of turning fertile, coaxing long-buried thoughts to rise like weeds after a storm. "Just restless, I guess," I murmured. "You're always restless." She poured herself a mug of coffee that had been sitting on the stovetop since 6 o'clock. The scent of it, stale and bitter, drifted up and mingled with the lingering smell of old fryer oil from the back. "But tonight's different. You're wound up tighter than usual. What's going on?" I didn't have a chance to answer. The bell above the door rang out, sharp and sudden. The old wood creaked open, ushering in a gust of frigid air laced with dust and pine resin from the woods beyond town. A man stepped inside, his presence cutting through the stillness like a blade. He wore a long black wool coat that reached his knees, polished brown leather shoes, and a pair of sunglasses resting precisely on the bridge of his nose, though the darkness outside was nearly absolute. His gait was slow but sure, every step deliberate, as if measured and weighed before he took it. I felt, with a strange certainty, that all the noise in the diner had just drained away. I glanced over at Kayla. She had looked up from her phone too, her eyes fixed on the man as if he were a scene from a film suddenly breaking into real life. Without a word, he chose the far corner table by the window, the one usually reserved by habit for our longtime regulars. I picked up a menu and started toward him, heart racing in a way I couldn't pin down, whether from the cold or instinct or something deeper that had no name. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything?" I asked as I laid the menu in front of him. He didn't glance at the page. He didn't even look at me right away. His eyes swept the diner slowly, as though searching for something invisible in the air around him, and then they landed on me. When they did, I felt it like a cold touch down my spine. It wasn't rude, that gaze, but it was intensely focused, studying me with the quiet intensity of someone trying to place a memory that matters, like I was a missing piece in a picture he'd been carrying too long. I bent slightly to pour him a glass of water, and in that small motion, the silver pendant I wore slipped from beneath my shirt and fell against the table with a soft clink. I exhaled sharply, startled, and reached for it, but he was quicker. His hand, large but neatly kept, reached forward and picked up the pendant, letting it turn lightly in his palm. Something changed in his face then. Just for a second. The pale gray of his eyes darkened, his brows drew together, and his voice, low and steady until now, trembled with something unspoken, something strange and heavy. "No, it can't be," he whispered. Then he looked directly at me, the tone of his voice shifting into something firm and unmistakable. "This is my brother's face. Why? Why do you have this photograph? If you've stayed with us this far, then perhaps your heart, too, is slowly being drawn into Maggie's story. The story of a seemingly ordinary single mother, suddenly forced to confront long-buried secrets from the past. Before we move on to the next chapter, I want to take a moment to share a small message with you. If this story has stirred something in you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel so you won't miss the deeply moving stories we bring you each day. Click like to support the team behind this work, and consider sharing this video with someone in your life who might need a story like this right now. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or country and let us know how far these honest, heartfelt stories have traveled. And now, let us return to the story of Maggie and Vincent, where a long-buried truth is on the verge of being uncovered. I froze for a few seconds, trying to grasp what the man in front of me had just said. His words didn't just thicken the air around us. They gripped my chest like an invisible hand tightening from the inside. His brother? How could that be possible? I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, to take back the pendant from his grasp, but he didn't let go. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny photograph inside, as if time itself had wrapped around him and refused to move forward. The old photo, worn by years of closeness to skin and memory, showed a young man with a tilted smile and eyes that radiated warmth. The man I had loved. The man I thought I had known. Daniel. I whispered, and the moment that name left my lips, something in him shifted. His shoulders dropped ever so slightly, like someone hearing a sound too familiar and too painful all at once. "So you know his name," he said, his voice growing heavier. "How did you know, Daniel?" I tightened my fingers around the pendant and instinctively took a half step back. By now, Kayla had come closer, her face tight with concern and quiet alarm. I must have looked unsteady. I felt unsteady. It was as if I had been yanked out of reality and thrown into a place where nothing I once trusted could be trusted anymore. "I'm sorry. I don't understand what you're saying," I managed to reply, my voice thin and dry as paper. He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on my face, searching, measuring, and then, as if something within me confirmed what he needed to know, he nodded slowly. "My name is Vincent Russo. Daniel was my younger brother," he said. "He died 5 years ago, in what the newspapers called an armed robbery, but that wasn't the whole truth. His death was the result of betrayal. And now I need to know why you have that photograph, and what Daniel was to you." Each word struck me like a stone thrown into a still lake, breaking the surface of my composure into spreading rings of shock and sorrow. Daniel was dead, not missing, not run off, dead, 5 years ago. His death wasn't some abstract wound I had imagined in moments of solitude and silence. It had a date, a cause, a weight that had crushed more than just me. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My throat closed up, and my heart pounded like a drum in an empty hall. I had spent all these years raising a child alone, carrying a love that had never found its end, always asking myself why he had left without a word. I had told myself he was weak. I had hated him. But now, he had died, and the man standing before me, whose eyes looked so eerily like his, was his brother. I looked at Vincent and felt something I couldn't name. Not fear, not trust, just the quiet, startling sense that I had touched a corner of the truth I had spent so long pretending did not exist. Daniel used to live in Boston. He worked in finance. "I met him at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital," I began, my voice barely more than a whisper, as though I were speaking more to myself than to the man in front of me. "He was kind, reserved, a little quiet. We were together for almost a year. Then one day, he disappeared. No call, no letter. I waited. I didn't know. I never knew what happened to him." Vincent nodded. His face didn't shift much, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly, like a piece of a long, elusive puzzle had finally found its place. "Do you have a child?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, then gave a small nod. "A daughter. Her name is Sophie. She's 5. Vincent closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though he were bracing himself for another weight he hadn't yet prepared to carry. "We need to talk. Not here," he said, glancing around the diner, where Kayla stood quietly in the distance, watching us with a look of concern edged with caution. "I'm not going anywhere with a stranger," I replied quickly, my instincts flaring up like a wall. "I understand, but if Daniel really was the father of your daughter, and if you're holding on to something of his without knowing it, then I'm afraid I'm not the only one who'll be looking for you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Vincent reached into his wallet and placed a business card on the table. It bore nothing but his name and a string of numbers. No logo, no company, just black ink pressed into stark white. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "If you want the truth, and if you want to keep your daughter safe." I stared at the card he left behind as though it might somehow explain all the unanswered questions that had haunted me for the past 5 years. The letters of his name, printed in simple black on a smooth, unmarked background, said almost nothing, and yet they made my heart skip a beat. No address, no title, no company, just a name and a phone number. There was something about that stark simplicity that felt both cautious and dangerous, like this man lived his life somewhere in the gray space between what was lawful and what was not. I don't know what made me believe he wasn't lying. Maybe it was the eyes so uncannily like Daniel's, or maybe it was the way he looked at the pendant, like the world had cracked open at his feet in a single breath. I slipped the card into my pocket, my hand still shaking. Kayla stepped forward then, placing her hand gently on my shoulder, like she was afraid I might break. "Maggie, are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though nothing inside me felt remotely okay. My thoughts were a tangled skein, memories rising like floodwaters after a long drought. I needed air. I needed space from the name Vincent Russo, and the past I had tried so hard to bury. But that name kept echoing in my head. Russo. Daniel Russo. Why had I never known his last name? How many times had I asked? And each time Daniel had just smiled and told me it didn't matter. That his last name wasn't important. I had thought it was his way of keeping a little privacy. Now I knew. He had been hiding a whole other life. I left the diner just before midnight. The cold had deepened, sharper than usual, and the mountain winds blowing down from the north stirred the dry leaves across the empty sidewalks with a sound like whispers. My old car was parked 3 blocks away. Every step I took felt like walking through memory. Boston, autumn afternoons with him. The way Daniel would take my hand and lead me along the edge of the Charles River, talking about small, gentle dreams, opening a bookstore, planting a garden, having a child, a life of quiet simplicity. We had planned to move to Flagstaff together. He told me it was peaceful here, that no one would bother us. I had thought I was the reason for that change, but now I knew. Maybe he had been running from something far greater than I could ever have imagined. By the time I got home, Sophie was asleep. She had left the living room light on, the way she always did when I worked the late shift. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep. Her soft, light brown hair tangled on the pillow, long lashes casting faint shadows over the face I knew so well, yet one that so often reminded me of someone who had vanished without a trace. I sat down beside her, my fingers brushing over the thin blanket. If what Vincent said was true, if Daniel really was dead, then that truth would not only shatter me, it would cut deep into Sophie too. She had a right to know who her father was, but could I tell her everything? Could anyone be truly safe when the name Russo entered the conversation? I didn't sleep that night. The ticking of the clock echoed through the stillness of the house, slow and steady, as though counting down to something I couldn't yet name. I kept thinking about Vincent, the way he spoke, the weight in his posture, the way he studied people with eyes that had seen too much. A man shaped by experience, who wore power like a tailored coat, hiding the scent of gunpowder beneath layers of refinement. I had heard the name Russo before, not in Daniel's stories, but in headlines, in whispers across news channels. Chicago, the Russo organization, wealth, power, old money, tangled in rumors of laundering, real estate empires, even ties to the Italian Mafia in America, but never charged, never convicted. And now that same name had walked into my small roadside diner and held in his hand the faded image of the man I had once loved. I opened the cupboard and reached for the old tin box I had hidden above the kitchen shelves. Inside were all the pieces of Daniel I had managed to keep. Photographs of us together, scraps of notes, a letter I had written but never sent. I wrote it after he disappeared. My handwriting shaky, blotched with tears, filled with anger that slowly gave way to sorrow. I hadn't kept it because I believed he would come back. I kept it because I couldn't accept that he had simply vanished. Now I had something, a trace, a name, Vincent Russo. Before the sky turned pale, I had made my decision. I would meet him, not because I trusted him, but because I needed to know the truth. I couldn't keep living in the quiet ache of not knowing, not when every time I looked into my daughter's eyes, I wondered if somewhere in their depths was a fear passed down from a father who had been hunted and killed. And I couldn't forgive myself if I turned my back on the truth just because I was afraid of what it might mean. I woke earlier than usual the next morning. The sky over Flagstaff was heavy and gray, thick with low clouds that promised rain, but the weather barely registered with me. I brewed coffee and sat quietly by the window, watching Sophie eat breakfast, my thoughts knotted tight. She was chewing on toast, fidgeting with her hair tie, completely unaware that in just a few hours, her mother would step into a part of the past that was never meant to exist. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady as I reminded her about school, the lunch I had packed, and that I'd be picking her up early today. She smiled, nodded like always, then hugged me quickly before dashing out the door. I stood there for a long time, watching her small frame disappear around the bend, before turning back inside, grabbing my coat, and heading to the car. I arrived at the diner just before 8. Vincent was already there. He was sitting at the same table as the night before, but this time he wasn't wearing the long black coat. He wore a dark shirt and a pale gray vest. He didn't look like a businessman, and he didn't exactly look like a criminal either. He looked like something in between, like someone who had lived many lives in a single body that time had only just begun to mark. When I walked over, he nodded and motioned to the seat across from him. No coffee, no menu, no small talk. I told you I'd bring proof, he said, pulling a slim folder from the leather bag beside him and laying it on the table. I stared at it, hesitant. My heart pounded as he opened the folder and slid out a single sheet of paper bearing a faded red official seal. I saw the name on the first line. Daniel Matteo Russo. Born in Boston. Died on the 18th of November, 5 years ago. Cause of death, gunshot wound at close range. Manner of death, homicide. Time of death, 10:48 p.m. Location, South Harbor District, Chicago. Name of next of kin, Vincent Russo. I couldn't breathe, every line carved into me, like a blade. Every number, every word was ice on my skin. I lifted the paper with unsteady hands. The paper was thick, the ink smudged in a few places, but nothing about it felt false. I knew. I could feel the truth in the cold that crept up my spine. I got there 10 minutes after he was shot, Vincent said, his voice strangely calm. I held my brother's body, and I swore on his blood that I would find the one who betrayed him. I've spent 5 years following every thread, every name, and now, the last piece is you. I set the paper down, my throat dry and burning. I don't understand. What do you mean? I had nothing to do with any of this. I didn't even know he was dead. Vincent tilted his head, his eyes locked on mine. You were the last person Daniel trusted. I know he lied to you, about who he was, what he did, even about his family. But if he left you that pendant, it wasn't just sentimental. It meant something, a code, an address, a message. Daniel never did anything without a reason. I shook my head, my mind spinning. I don't know anything about codes or addresses. I just know he loved me. And then he left. No, Vincent said, and his voice dropped to something darker. He didn't leave. He was murdered. And whoever killed him is still out there. And they may already be watching you. And your daughter. I felt my entire body go still. Each word he spoke seemed to pull the blood from my veins. You're saying, Sophie and I are in danger? Vincent nodded slowly. If I found you, they can too. They believe you have something Daniel hid. You don't have much time, Maggie. If you want to survive this, you have to trust me. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest like stone. Daniel was dead. Sophie was the daughter of a man who had lived in shadows. And now, we were standing at the edge of something we'd never even known we were part of. A game already in motion. And we were pieces on its board. I don't remember exactly when I nodded, only that Vincent had looked at me for a long time after those final words. And then he rose from his chair and pulled it back as if everything had already been decided. Maybe some part of me had made the choice the night before, when I opened the old tin box filled with memories and the letter I never sent. Or maybe it was the moment he said my daughter might be in danger. Fear has a way of silencing every rational thought, and when it ties itself to someone you love more than life, the questions stop mattering. All I could think about was Sophie, her safety. And if I wanted that, I needed to understand everything. Vincent told me there was a safe place. Somewhere he had been storing the documents Daniel left behind before his death. A house high in the mountains of Colorado, tucked where no one could easily follow. He said I only needed to bring what was essential. The rest, he would handle. It all sounded like something out of a thriller, and I still wasn't sure if I was awake or caught inside a strange, slow-burning dream. But there I was, in the passenger seat of Vincent's sleek black SUV, with a small suitcase in the back containing a few changes of clothes, my ID, and the pendant resting just over my heart. We left Flagstaff around noon. The sky remained overcast, but the clouds had begun to thin. Through the window, the scenery shifted from the wooded edges of a small town to barren plateaus, then to the distant outlines of purple-blue mountains. We didn't speak for nearly an hour. I didn't know where to begin, and Vincent, it seemed, understood that I needed time. He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. There was something in his silence that didn't feel threatening. Instead, it was strangely familiar, almost mournful, as if he carried the same breath as Daniel. Maybe it was his voice. Maybe it was his eyes. Or maybe it was just that both men came from a world I had never truly understood. Did Daniel ever tell you anything about our family? Vincent finally asked, breaking the stillness. I shook my head, my eyes still on the landscape passing by. Not much. He just said it was complicated, that he wanted to leave it all behind and start over. I thought maybe he just didn't get along with his parents. Vincent gave a quiet laugh, though there was no joy in it. It was the sound of someone who had long since stopped expecting things to make sense. Our family isn't like other families. My father once ran an underground investment network. Back in the 80s, he controlled most of the East Coast real estate scene. Later, he moved into legal casinos in Nevada. Daniel was the only one who never got involved. He believed in ethics, in principles, in change. He thought he could clean up a lake that had been poisoned for generations. I told him it was a foolish dream, but Daniel never let go of what he believed in. I turned to look at Vincent. There was a sorrow in his eyes that ran deep, not the sorrow of a man who had done wrong, but of someone who had watched goodness get crushed under the weight of the world. "Were you and Daniel close?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "We were, when we were kids. Daniel was the only one who reminded me I was still human. But when I got deeper into our father's world, we grew apart. Still, I watched over him. When he said he wanted out, I helped. I gave him a new identity, a job, a quiet life. But then one day he called me, and his voice was shaking. He said something wasn't right, that someone within our own circle was betraying us. 2 days later, he was dead. I turned my face toward the window, and without realizing it, the tears came, soft, steady, unstoppable. Outside, the clouds were finally breaking. Sunlight slipped through the windshield and caught the edge of the steering wheel, casting a warm glow across the cabin. I tightened my grip on the pendant against my chest, as if to remind myself that all of this was real, that what I was hearing wasn't someone else's story. It was mine, and my daughter's. Daniel hadn't run from me. He had run for me, for us. He had tried to leave a message, something I never knew how to hear. But now I had to listen, wherever that message led, whatever it cost. We arrived at the cabin just as dusk settled over the treetops. It was tucked deep within the woods, far from any main road, hidden beneath a canopy of thick pines and surrounded by long, sloping ridges of rock that stretched into the distance like sleeping giants. Vincent cut the engine, pulled the keys from the ignition, and turned to look at me. I gave a small nod, saying nothing. The air here was damp and cool, laced with the scent of moss and rotting wood, but it didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like a quiet pause inside the storm that was still churning in my chest. Vincent stepped out first. I followed close behind, my feet cautious on the old wood planks of the porch, worn dark by years of weather. The cabin was small, just a living room, a tiny kitchen, and 2 modest bedrooms. Everything inside was spare but orderly. It didn't look like a place of danger, but rather like a quiet refuge, the kind of place someone might choose to disappear into when the world became too much. It felt like Daniel. Vincent led me to a wooden table tucked in the corner of the room. On it sat an old iron chest. He unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck. Inside were neatly stacked folders, faded photographs, and on top of it all, a weathered leather notebook, its corners worn smooth with time. He lifted it gently and placed it into my hands. "Daniel's journal," he said. "He left it 3 days before he died." I didn't read much of it. I couldn't. I thought maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe for you. I held the journal, my fingers trembling. The feeling of touching something he had once carried, once opened and written in with his own hands, stopped the breath in my throat. Inside the front cover, a few lines were scrawled in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, thin, steady, unflinching. The first entry was dated June, 5 years ago. I flipped through a few pages. Some were short notes, fragments of thoughts or cryptic references to people I didn't recognize. But then, buried midway through the pages, I saw my name. Maggie, spelled out in full, not abbreviated, not hidden between the lines. I know I can't stay, no matter how much I want to. Maggie doesn't understand where I come from, and I can't drag her into this. But every morning I wake up and see her smile. I feel like stopping. I want to be just a man, a father, a lover, but I don't get to have that. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Just beneath those words, the ink was blurred, smeared as if he had written them through tears. My chest tightened. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't turned his back and walked away. He had made a choice to protect me, to protect Sophie. Instead of pulling us into the darkness he couldn't escape, he had tried to shield us from it. I turned more pages and stopped at a hurried, slanted entry. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. Franco file, transaction dated November 12th. Evidence on USB hidden under the kitchen table. If anything happens to me, give it to Vincent. I read it again and again. The fear I'd managed to suppress began creeping back in. Franco, a name I had never heard from Daniel's lips, but in that one note, something sharpened into focus. Someone named Franco had either betrayed him or played a part in what happened, and the proof, if it still existed, was here, in this house. I looked up and found Vincent watching me closely, as if he'd been waiting for me to find that exact line. I suspected Franco De Santi, he said quietly. He was a senior financial officer in my father's old network, but I never had proof. Daniel said something felt off. Now I believe he found what he wasn't supposed to, and he paid for it. I sat there, clutching the journal, my heart pounding as the pieces began to shift and settle into a shape I didn't yet recognize. Daniel had left a trail, not just of love, but of truth, and the last step of that trail had led here to me. Vincent stepped into the small kitchen, knelt down, and ran his hand along the underside of the wooden table. A few moments later, he pulled free a flash drive, carefully wrapped in black electrical tape. He placed it in my palm. Small, cold, heavier than it should have been. We'll open it when we're somewhere safer, he said. We can't be sure this place isn't being watched. I nodded. My mind was a storm of questions, each one spinning and crashing into the next, but all of them seemed to circle the same point. Daniel hadn't stayed silent. He had left a trail, and I, who had once believed I'd been left behind, was now the one holding that thread. I looked down at the USB, then at the journal resting in my lap. Beneath the stack of files in the chest, a few old photographs caught my eye. One showed Daniel and a man with Vincent's face, though younger, both standing in front of a red brick wall that might have been somewhere in Chicago. They looked young, unburdened. Their faces hadn't yet learned the weight of suspicion or the fatigue of surviving too long. Another photo. Daniel, cradling a newborn. There was no label, no note, but I knew. I knew without doubt that the baby in his arms was Sophie. The curve of her smile, the shape of her eyes. You don't forget the face that changed your life. I picked it up, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry not for the loss, but for the return of something I thought time and silence had already destroyed. A piece of love, still intact, still real. The rain started as night settled over the woods surrounding the cabin. I listened as it fell against the metal roof, ran through pine needles, and dripped steadily from the eaves. The sound was low and rhythmic, like a distant lullaby sung to no one in particular. I sat near the fireplace, Daniel's journal still open on my lap, the USB resting in the hollow of my hand like a secret too dangerous to name. Vincent moved quietly around the cabin, checking the windows, securing the locks. His face no longer held the calm it had earlier that day. Since I'd found the note about Franco and the evidence Daniel left behind, something between us had shifted. No words were needed. We both knew what it meant. Once we looked at what was inside that USB, once we crossed that invisible line, we would be seen, and once we were seen, there would be no going back. If Daniel died for what I held now, the people who had silenced him wouldn't let that mistake happen twice. Vincent returned, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. He placed one beside me, then sank into the chair across from mine. The firelight flickered across his features, deepening the lines carved by time and loss. We sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the groaning of wind through the trees and the soft crackle of wood burning down to ash. I sent someone I trust back to Flagstaff, he said quietly. He's going to check if anyone's been following your trail, but I don't think we have much time. I gripped the flash drive tighter. You think they'll come here? He nodded once. It's likely. You're not just carrying that pendant, you're carrying Daniel's daughter. If Franco knows that, he won't stay silent. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Sophie, I hadn't told her anything. Not about Daniel, not about what we were walking into. How? Could I? How do you explain to a 5-year-old girl that the father she never met was once a man trying to outrun his own family, and that now, that same bloodline might come for her? I had never imagined my life would lead here. I had been just a single mother, a waitress in a small roadside diner, doing my best to make rent, stretch groceries, help with homework, and survive each month without falling apart. I wasn't meant for this world of secrets, of guns, and vengeance. I hadn't been trained to live in the shadow of danger. But here I was, and whether I was ready or not, the world Daniel had tried so hard to keep from me was finally breaking through, and I would have to decide right now if I was strong enough to step into it. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for Sophie, for the truth she deserved, and for the man who had tried, until his final breath, to protect the people he loved. Vincent's phone began to vibrate. He pulled it from the inside pocket of his coat, glanced at the screen, and without a word, stepped toward the window as he answered. I couldn't hear what he was saying, only saw the tension rise in his shoulders, the way his voice dropped, low and clipped, and how his hand gripped the phone tighter with every passing second. When he finally turned back toward me, his face had changed. It was graver, set with something that felt heavier than anything we had spoken of so far. "It was my guy," he said. "Someone was asking about you at Rosewood this morning. Not the police. They didn't leave a name, just showed your photo and Daniel's. Asked if anyone had seen the two of you recently." It felt like a blow landed square in my gut. My breath caught, shallow and fast, and my vision blurred with the sudden sting of fear. "They know I'm alive. They're looking for me." Vincent nodded once. "Which means we have to go. Tonight. The sooner the better." I stood up abruptly. "Sophie, I need to call her. She's staying at my friend's house, but if they find the house, they'll—" Vincent stepped forward, his hand landing gently but firmly on my shoulder. His voice was steady, anchoring mine. "We'll get her. You call ahead. Tell them you want to pick her up early. Say there's a change of plans. Nothing more. No fear in your voice. Then we leave. Immediately." I nodded, reaching for my phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the contacts. I pressed Kayla's number, my heart pounding as the dial tone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then her voice came through, still groggy with sleep. "Maggie? What's going on?" I swallowed and forced my voice into something calm, something that didn't betray the storm inside me. "Kayla, I know it's late, but can you bring Sophie to the gas station near the school? Something's come up. I need to leave town for a bit." There was a pause on the other end, brief but telling. Then Kayla answered, slower, this time. "Okay. But are you all right? You don't sound like yourself." I closed my eyes for a second. "I'm fine. Just a personal matter. Thanks, Kayla." I ended the call and sat back down, my hands still shaking. Across the room, Vincent was pulling gear from a black backpack, an unregistered pistol, a few changes of clothes, forged documents. Watching him, I realized something I hadn't admitted until now. He had been preparing for this moment for a long time, maybe since the day Daniel died, or maybe from the moment he first saw my face and recognized what was left of his brother's life staring back at him. I reached for Daniel's journal and slipped it back into my bag. The photo of him holding Sophie, I folded it carefully, placed it beside the small folding knife tucked into the lining of my coat. I didn't remember when I had started thinking like this. Maybe single motherhood taught me more than how to stretch a paycheck or stay up all night with a feverish child. Maybe it had always been about learning how to survive what couldn't be predicted. But this was something else. This wasn't about scraped knees or overdue bills. This was about staying alive. And I knew, as clearly as I had ever known anything, that the signs were no longer subtle. The wheels had turned, the line had been crossed, the door to the past was open, and there was no closing it now. We left the cabin just 15 minutes after the call with Kayla. The night sky above the Colorado forest no longer held rain, but the fog had thickened, so dense it strangled the headlights into a dull cone of light, sweeping uselessly across the winding dirt road. Vincent drove without music, without a word, his eyes locked on the road with a focus so sharp it felt like he was counting every turn, every mile. I sat beside him in silence, clutching my phone as if letting go might cause everything to unravel. My mind spun wildly. My heart pounded like a warning, drum in my chest, and the only thought that mattered was reaching Sophie fast. The gas station Kayla had mentioned sat just off the west exit of town, barely 3 minutes from the school. It took us over 3 hours to reach it. When we pulled in, I saw them immediately, Kayla and Sophie, standing under the awning, washed in the pale light of flickering bulbs. Sophie clutched her backpack, her face a mix of fatigue and confusion as she caught sight of me stepping out of an unfamiliar SUV. Kayla's brows rose, her eyes quickly shifting toward Vincent, who stood by the passenger door with the posture of a man who never truly relaxes. The wariness in her gaze was unmistakable. "Maggie," she called, stepping forward. "What's going on? Where are you going in the middle of the night with Sophie?" I didn't answer right away. I crossed the pavement in 3 strides and pulled Sophie into my arms, holding her close, breathing her in. The warmth of her body steadied me for a moment. She didn't ask questions, maybe because she'd grown used to my sudden shifts in plan, but Kayla wasn't so easily pacified. Her eyes stayed sharp, and her attention never left Vincent for more than a second. "I can't explain right now," I said, keeping my voice low. "But I need you to trust me, Kayla. I need to go. And please, don't tell anyone you saw me tonight. Please." She stared at me for a long time, then slowly nodded. "All right, but if you need anything at all, call me." I squeezed her hand, then turned, pulling Sophie gently toward the car. Vincent opened the back door, his eyes never leaving the lot. I climbed in last, and as we pulled away from the station, I saw it. A gray sedan parked across the street, tucked near a dead street lamp. No front plate, tinted windows, and for just a second, just a flicker, I saw it. A tiny flash of light near the driver's side, a cigarette, a watcher, someone waiting. "Vincent," I said sharply, turning in my seat. "There's someone over there, watching." He didn't need to look. He'd already seen it. Without a word, he pressed harder on the gas, and the SUV veered off the main road, taking a narrow side route that curved away from town. I glanced behind us. The gray sedan moved, two headlights cutting on, the vehicle sliding into motion like a shadow waking from sleep. Fear curled tight in my stomach. "Mama, what's happening?" Sophie's voice trembled. I reached back, took her hand, and tried to steady mine. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just stay quiet and keep your seatbelt on. I'm right here." Vincent made a hard turn onto a dirt road, then suddenly cut the headlights and eased the SUV into a dense grove between two tree lines. He killed the engine and motioned for silence. We waited. Seconds passed. Then the sedan glided past us, unaware. Its headlights swept the road ahead and then disappeared into the mist. Vincent didn't move. He waited until the last glow of taillights vanished into the trees. Only then did he turn to me, his voice low. "They're closer than I thought. They're tracking the girl. They know who she is." I held Sophie tighter, my whole body shaking. "What do they want? Are they going to hurt her?" Vincent shook his head, but there was no comfort in his answer. His voice had gone flat. "They need her alive, at least until they get what they think Daniel left behind. But if they start to lose control of the situation, if they sense they can't use you, then both of you become liabilities." The words knocked the air from my lungs. Brutal. Cold. But I knew he wasn't exaggerating. The world Daniel had tried to leave behind and that Vincent had never fully escaped was not a place of mercy. I looked down at Sophie. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just watched me, as if waiting for instruction, as if she already understood that something was wrong. She looked so much like Daniel in that moment. It stole the breath from my chest. That quiet stillness in the face of danger. That impossible calm. It was as if part of him was already alive in her, guiding her through the dark. And in that terrifying silence, I knew I would do anything to protect her. Anything. Vincent turned the wheel and took us away from the forest, steering toward the mountains. He didn't tell me where we were going, only that it was a place even more remote than the cabin we had just left. I didn't ask. I didn't care how far it was. As long as Sophie was safe, as long as I could keep her within reach of my arms, I would go anywhere, to the ends of the earth if that's what it took. We arrived at the new hideout just before dawn. It was a small, weathered house tucked deep into a limestone valley in northern Colorado, nestled between bare hills and so far off the main road that even cell reception wavered in and out like a distant voice on the wind. Vincent said it once belonged to an old friend of his, a place for winter escapes, but no one had been here in years. The house was aged but sturdy, with a brick fireplace, a narrow kitchen, and 2 adjoining bedrooms. Sophie fell asleep as soon as we laid her down, curled beneath a wool blanket that smelled faintly of dust and cedar. I sat beside her in the dim light, watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing like it was the only sound keeping my fear from taking over completely. Vincent moved quietly into the kitchen, opened his worn laptop, and inserted the USB. I poured 2 glasses of water, my hands still trembling slightly. When I stepped into the room, he had already opened the first files. The screen filled with spreadsheets, scanned documents, screenshots all labeled with cryptic file names, lines of numbers, initials, and transaction codes that made little sense to an outsider. But Vincent seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. "There," he said under his breath, his eyes locked on the screen. "The November 12th transaction. Just like Daniel wrote in the journal. A massive transfer of funds from a Swiss subsidiary to an anonymous trust account in the Bahamas. But what's strange is the name on the approval signature." I leaned in to look. On the screen was a scanned financial document. The signature was partially smudged, but still legible enough to catch the first 2 letters. Franco D. Vincent pointed to the lower corner of the screen. Franco De Santi. He was once the head of internal controls for my father's network. He shouldn't have had access to high-level financial transactions. But if his name appears on this transfer millions of dollars, then he had authority. Or worse, he took it without permission. And if Daniel found that out, I remembered the frantic journal entry, the warning, the betrayal, and suddenly, a memory rose in me, one I hadn't touched in years. A fall night, 5 years ago. Daniel had come home later than usual, his face drawn, his shoulders heavy. He didn't say much, just kissed my forehead, sat in the kitchen, and drank black coffee long into the early hours. I'd asked if something was wrong. He had only shaken his head. The next morning when I woke, he was gone, only a note left behind. Back then, I thought it was stress. I thought he needed space. Now I knew. Maybe that was the night he discovered something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe that was the night that sealed his fate. What can we do with this? I asked, my voice unsteady but trying to stay grounded. Vincent leaned back in his chair, the glow from the laptop flickering across his face as he considered his next words. We can't go to the police. Not yet. Men like Franco can buy silence from judges, detectives, even prosecutors. But I have a contact. Someone in the FBI. He used to be my partner before I walked away. If we can gather more evidence, especially if we can link this transaction to a specific crime, he might open a quiet, independent investigation. Something internal. Off the books. He looked at me then, not with hope, but with the steadiness of someone who's waited a long time to be believed, to be heard. And in that moment, as Sophie slept just one room away, and Daniel's digital ghost flickered in spreadsheets and buried files, I realized we were no longer just running. We were beginning to fight. I stared at the screen, watching the cold, emotionless numbers flicker before me. Each figure, each line of data, might have been the reason Daniel never came back. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the thing that could keep Sophie safe. I reached out and let my hand drift across the files, as if I could somehow touch the truth they held, still warm beneath the weight of silence. And then, at the bottom of the USB directory, Vincent found something else, an audio file. He clicked play. Daniel's voice came through, low and rough at first, as though he had recorded it late into the night, long after sleep had given up on him. If someone's hearing this, it means I've run out of time. I don't trust the internal network anymore. Franco is moving large amounts of money through shell companies. I've copied the data, and I think he knows. I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid for her, for Maggie. If anyone finds her, please, protect her. And my child. I didn't move. My hands tightened around the arms of the chair. That voice, I'd heard it 100 times before. I had fallen asleep to that voice, lying next to him on cold winter nights, listening to him whisper stories, make jokes, tell me about the world he wanted to build. But this time, it was the voice of a man who knew he was going to die. A man who had chosen to speak the truth, even knowing it might cost him everything. Vincent shut off the recording. In the stillness of the kitchen, the only sound was the wind hissing through the cracks in the door. He turned to me, and for the first time, the steel in his eyes had softened. Daniel placed his final trust in you, he said. Now it's our turn to finish what he started. I didn't sleep that night. After Vincent turned off the recording, we sat together in silence at the kitchen table, unmoving as the hours slipped by. Occasionally, I could hear Sophie shifting gently in the next room, her breathing steady, like the fragile pulse of something pure and innocent holding me together. The words Daniel had left behind looped in my mind. He hadn't just left evidence, he'd left a farewell, a final gift, a plea. And even in his last moments, he wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of us, of me, of Sophie. Franco De Santi, the man Daniel once trusted like a brother, had been the one to destroy him. Not with rage, not with open betrayal, but with the cold, calculated silence of someone who had watched him grow up, who had once shielded him, and then, one day, decided that protecting the system mattered more than protecting the man. Vincent told me Franco had once been a street kid, taken in by Vincent's father when he was barely 10. Trained, educated, sharpened like a knife, quiet, brilliant, loyal, but not to people, to structure, to the invisible web that held the power together. He had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight, never ambitious enough to claim the top, yet always present at the center of every decision. At the long tables of power, Franco sat at the end, silent, taking notes. When someone was arrested, he was never connected. When secrets leaked, he was always the one who found the leak. He built a reputation of quiet dependability so perfect that he became almost invisible. No one suspected that behind that silence was the deepest betrayal. Vincent said Daniel and Franco had once been close, grew up, side by side, shared memories, risks, even laughter. It was Franco who had once doctored data to protect Daniel from an internal investigation. But when Daniel began pulling away, trying to do the right thing, choosing to live outside the rules, something shifted. Franco didn't hate Daniel. He didn't kill him out of jealousy or revenge. He killed him because Daniel became a threat to the order he had sworn to maintain. In a system built on silence and survival, there could be no room for redemption, no room for someone who remembered his conscience. Franco was not just enforcing control, he was preserving it, and in his eyes, Daniel had become the crack in the foundation that could bring it all down. And now, the only thing standing in his way was me. I sat beside Vincent as he opened the next file, this time, a video. Security footage from a law office in Chicago. The timestamp read, November 12th, one day before Daniel was murdered. On the grainy screen, I watched Daniel walk into the frame, carrying a thick folder under his arm. He glanced around the room, scanning for someone. Just seconds later, Franco appeared. The two of them exchanged a few words. There was no audio. But you could read the tension in Daniel's posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, how he gestured with the file in his hands. Franco, by contrast, was composed, unbothered, not a flicker of alarm or anger, no shouting, no confrontation, just quiet words between two men who, for years, had called each other family. But what chilled me, what made something go cold deep inside, was the way Franco looked at the camera before he left. He stared straight into the lens, not with surprise, not even curiosity, but with awareness, as if he knew someone might one day find this, as if he wanted them to see him looking. And then he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone in the room. 6 hours later, Daniel disappeared. That's when Daniel handed over the terrier. Evidence, Vincent said, eyes fixed on the screen. He still thought Franco might help him, that he'd protect him, but instead Franco turned it over, to the other side. He sold him out. When it was done, he erased every trace. If it weren't for this USB drive, Daniel's death would have been just another anonymous disappearance. My fingers clenched so tightly that the knuckles turned white. With every new piece of evidence, the image of Franco sharpened in my mind, not as a monster in the shadows, but as something colder, someone methodical, patient, willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain control. He didn't kill Daniel with his own hands, but the order had been his, and now he was hunting us, not out of revenge, but because we were a threat, because what we carried, Daniel's truth, had the power to bring down the entire structure Franco had helped build, and that made him more dangerous than anyone we had faced before. Vincent pulled open a drawer and tossed a worn folder onto the table. Inside were photographs of Franco at public events, always in the background, never at the podium, banking documents, internal memos, and at the bottom, a handwritten letter. The script slanted slightly, neat but pressed hard into the paper. Daniel's writing. Asterisk. Franco once told me that if I ever betrayed the organization, he'd be the first to strike. I didn't believe him then. I do now. He wasn't joking. Asterisk. Reading those words was like feeling a hand close around my chest. Daniel had known. He'd suspected it. Feared it. But still somewhere in him he'd held out hope. Hope that Franco wouldn't betray him. Hope that friendship would mean something. But he was wrong. And now I was the only one left to make it right. I looked up at Vincent. His face was steady, ready. And so was I. This wasn't just Daniel's story anymore. And it wasn't just mine. This was about justice. About truth. About a debt that needed to be paid, no matter the cost. The safe house Vincent brought us to this time wasn't like the last. It was deeper off the grid, tucked into a narrow valley shielded by dry hills and crooked trees. The path in was barely visible, littered with leaves and fallen branches that made it look like no one had been through in years. The house itself was modest, low to the ground, brick walls stained with time, and a single floor with no windows facing the main path. But there were cameras small, nearly invisible at every corner, every angle, watching everything. The silence inside was total. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that heightens every sense, that makes your breath feel too loud. Vincent told me and Sophie to rest, that he would keep watch, that we were safe for now. But none of us would sleep, because now we knew what we carried. Now we knew what we had to do. And we also knew we weren't alone anymore. Franco was watching. I sat alone in the small room, the dim yellow light, casting a soft glow across the floorboards, cupping Daniel's journal in my hands. The corners of the pages had grown worn from the way I kept turning them, over and over, like a prayer I hadn't yet memorized. Beyond the far wall, Vincent was checking weapons with quiet precision, and Sophie lay in the adjoining room, clutching the same pillow she'd carried from Flagstaff. Through the glass, the backyard disappeared into shadow, the kind of darkness so thick it seemed to hold its breath. The quiet here wasn't peaceful, it was weighted, like something ancient watching from the trees. I leaned my head against the wall, my eyes fixed on the blurred night beyond the window. But my mind was far from it, drifting backward, toward the beginning. I remembered the first time I met Daniel. It was spring. Late in the afternoon, during a quiet shift at Rosewood Cafe. I was wiping down the front tables when he walked in, soaked from the rain, wearing a black coat and carrying exhaustion in his eyes like it had settled there long ago. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He sat at the table by the window and said nothing for nearly 30 minutes. When I brought the check, he looked up for the first time. And that faint smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, stayed with me for weeks afterward. We started with small conversations, then longer ones, then evening walks around town when the weather turned cold. Daniel never said much about himself, but he always asked about me, about Sophie, what she liked in school, what frightened her, and whenever I spoke, he listened like there was nothing else in the world worth hearing. I once asked him why he always kept his distance, even when we were close. He smiled and said there were parts of him no one could touch. I thought he meant heartbreak. I didn't know then that he was trying to keep me out of a world he could never leave, and it was that very restraint that made me love him more. Because of everyone who'd ever come and gone in my life, Daniel was the only one who never made promises but always kept them. Now, as I sat in this safe house deep in the woods, surrounded by silence and the ghosts of what we'd lost, I finally understood the loneliness he had carried, and that loneliness was now mine, passed from his hands to mine like an unfinished letter. In the pocket of my coat, the USB still rested, warm from my body heat, but cold in meaning. A quiet fire, the last piece of proof, a record of betrayal, of death, and maybe, if we were lucky, a way to survive. Soft footsteps in the hall made me look up. Vincent entered the room, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. He handed one to me and sat down in the chair beside mine. His eyes were different tonight. Quieter. The sharp edge that usually surrounded him had softened, as though some unspoken weight had finally settled in his bones. "I never told Daniel I was proud of him," he said quietly, eyes fixed. On the floor. "The last time we spoke, we argued. I told him he was a fool for thinking he could change the system from the inside. He just laughed. Then he left. And he never came back. I said nothing. I felt something shift in my chest, a crack that hadn't been there before. I wanted to tell Vincent that Daniel knew, that he didn't need to hear it out loud, that somehow, despite everything, he still carried that love with him. But I didn't speak, because some grief doesn't ask for answers. Some pain can only be shared in silence. Vincent looked at me, and after a long moment asked, "If you could go back to that first day at Rosewood, knowing everything you know now how it ends, would you still fall in love with him?" I thought for a long while. Then I nodded. "I'd still love him," I whispered, "even if it was only for a moment." Outside, the wind picked up, rushing through the branches with a soft, broken voice, rustling the trees like old paper. And inside this small safe house tucked in the cold belly of the land, 3 people waited for morning, one carrying memory, one carrying regret, and one, the smallest of us, still holding the last fragile spark of hope that somehow, from the ashes of what had been lost, something true might rise again. Dawn came slowly, as if the night itself had refused to let go. The first light slipped quietly through the window slats, painting soft gold across the old wooden table where Vincent and I still sat, unchanged from the long hours before. The tea in our cups had gone cold long ago, but the warmth of memory lingered like dust in the air light, and everywhere. My eyes burned, though I couldn't tell if it was from sleeplessness or from all the stories still spinning in my chest. Vincent stood first, stretching in the heavy silence, the stiffness of too many days without rest visible in every movement. He looked back at me, and his gaze softened just slightly when he caught the plain rawness I hadn't yet hidden. Then he stepped toward the window, parted the curtain with 2 fingers, and looked out, the way someone does when they no longer believe in peace. The sky was pale blue now, and the fog was lifting gently from the grass. A quiet morning, but neither of us trusted it. "I'll check the perimeter," he said, his voice lower, rougher. I only nodded. When the door closed behind him, I finally rose and walked into the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and pressed it to my forehead. Everything inside me felt tangled, as if I had just woken from a dream too real to forget. Daniel's voice still echoed in my ears from the recording. The way he said my name, the weight in his final words, the journal pages that still carried the trace of his fingertips. And then there was Vincent, the man who had once lived in Daniel's shadow, now the only one left standing beside me. His presence both steadied me and made it hard to breathe. Something between us had shifted. Something we hadn't spoken of, but both felt quiet and unspoken, like the tension before a storm. When Vincent returned, he carried a bundle of firewood and a jug of water from the well. We made a simple breakfast, toasted bread, strong coffee. Sophie was still asleep, and the house was so quiet I could hear the water bubbling faintly on the stove. We didn't talk much, but our eyes kept meeting across the room, and each glance felt like a question neither of us knew how to answer. After the meal, I stepped outside and sat on the back porch alone. The safe house perched on a gentle slope, overlooking a wide valley brushed with pale grass and gray stone. The wind moved through my hair with the scent of damp earth and roots. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what life might have been like if none of this had happened. If Daniel were still alive. If we were here as a family, watching Sophie grow up in peace. Vincent joined me minutes later. He said nothing, just sat beside me. Not too close, but not far enough to feel like distance. The air between us was thick with unsaid things. Finally, he spoke. "You know," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon, "Daniel once told me that you were the only person who ever made him think about leaving all of it behind. At the time I was angry. I told him love made people weak. But now, I'm not so sure." I turned to look at him. His gaze didn't waver. It was as though he was speaking to a memory, not to me. "And still," I asked, my voice soft and low, "do you think Daniel should have chosen differently? A normal life? Left everything behind?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who'd carried the weight of truth a long time. No. He wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from what he knew was wrong. And because of that, he loved you the only way he could, even if it meant leaving. My chest tightened. I turned my eyes toward him, and this time, there was no armor between us. No more guarded silences. Just two people sitting in the rubble of what was, searching for something, anything to hold on to. Vincent looked back at me. His eyes were tired, deep, but not avoiding mine. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched my cheek. It was gentle, hesitant, and I didn't pull away. There was warmth in that touch, unfamiliar but strangely human. He leaned closer, his breath brushing my skin, his movement careful, like he was asking permission without a word. Our lips nearly met close enough that I could feel the beat of his heart, or maybe it was mine. And then, just before the moment tipped into something neither of us could undo, he stopped. His hand dropped. His eyes darkened. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "I shouldn't have. This isn't the time." I drew back too, a quiet ache opening in the space between us. I understood. We both did. Between us lay too many ghosts. Daniel, Sophie, the truth, the danger. And no kiss, however honest or tender, could erase what still lay ahead. Not now, not like this. Vincent rose first and walked back inside without another word, and I remained on the porch watching his silhouette disappear through the doorway, feeling my heart open only to close again just in time, as if trying to shield what pieces of the past I still carried. The past had not loosened its grip, and I was not ready to let it go, not when so much truth was still hidden in the shadows ahead. The phone rang near midday just as I set my cup of coffee on the kitchen table. Vincent was outside checking the rear cameras, and Sophie was in the bedroom reading. I glanced down at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. For a moment my heart stopped. A part of me wanted to ignore it, but something older, deeper, the instinct of a mother, made me answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, and before I could speak, a low male voice slid through the line, rough and unhurried, carrying its threat like a blade. "We have your daughter." The room spun. For several seconds I could not breathe. My hand ached from how tightly I gripped the phone. My voice cracked as I forced out the words. "You are lying. Sophie is here with me." "Are you sure?" he replied, a quiet laugh curling behind the words. "Go to the back door. Look carefully." I dropped the phone and ran, my footsteps slamming through the hallway. Vincent turned toward me from the fence, alert, but Sophie was nowhere. No soft murmur of her reading, no movement in the bedroom. I burst inside, calling her name, but only silence answered. The bedroom door stood open. The room was empty. On the bed, her book lay where she had folded the page. I stumbled back into the kitchen, my breath sharp and uneven. The phone still lay on the table, its screen glowing with merciless patience. I lifted it again, and the same voice returned, slower now, almost savoring the moment as I slipped into terror. If you want to see your daughter again, be ready to listen. Rage surged through me, shaking my voice. If you touch her, I will. You will do nothing, he cut in. Franco wants to talk. Only you. No Vincent Russo, no police, no one. If you bring anyone with you, or try anything foolish, we will send you her ear first. Then whatever else remains. My eyes burned as tears rose unchecked. We will not let you hurt her. We do not want to hurt her, he said. We want what Daniel stole, and you have it. Time and place will follow. Prepare yourself, Maggie. The line went dead. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, then ran outside. Vincent was already moving toward me, and when he saw my face, he understood before I spoke. Where is Sophie? He asked, his voice dropping into something cold enough to cut steel. They took her, I whispered, choking on the words. They said they will hurt her if I do not bring the evidence. They want me alone, no one else. Vincent said nothing for several seconds. His jaw tightened, and his expression hardened into something as severe as winter. He walked into the house, pulled out a map, and began marking points with deliberate strokes. I stood beside him, feeling as though the ground had opened beneath me. At last I said, I am going. Vincent looked up sharply. No, you are not walking into their trap. You cannot destroy everything Daniel died to protect. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but resolute. Vincent, I am Sophie's mother. I will not sit here while my daughter is out there with men like Franco. I do not care about my own life. I care about hers. We can find another way, he insisted. I have people. I can track them. There is no time, I said, my voice rising with fear and fury. You do not understand. They will kill her if they sense you are involved. You can help me, but I have to be the one. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment. Finally, he nodded once. Then you will not go unprepared. I nodded too, tears slipping down my cheeks, not from fear, but from the clarity of my purpose. I was no longer the woman wiping tables in a roadside diner. No longer someone who simply survived quietly for the sake of routine. I was Sophie's mother, and I would fight for her with everything I had. Dusk fell faster than I expected, the mountain sky shifting from pale blue to deep violet in what felt like minutes, as if time itself were racing alongside me. The safe house glowed with warm yellow light that cast soft shadows across the brick walls, and in the small mirror above the kitchen counter, I caught my reflection. My eyes were tired and darkened by nights without rest, but they no longer held the confusion of the morning. I had made my choice. There was no turning back. Somewhere out there, Sophie was waiting for me, perhaps trembling in some locked room, listening for my footsteps, and I would not fail her. Vincent placed an old travel bag on the table and unzipped it, revealing 3 handguns, 2 radios, and a folded map. He handed me a black Glock, lighter than I expected, yet unbearably heavy the moment it rested in my palm. I looked at him without asking anything, and he understood. He spread the map and pointed with a steady hand, his voice low and even. They want you at midnight, at the abandoned warehouse near Lake Sterling. That place used to be one of my father's old transfer sites, long deserted now, but still large enough for an ambush. There are 3 exits inside, 2 main ones, and a hidden tunnel at the back that only family members would know. I memorized every detail as though reciting an oath. Vincent went on, his finger tracing the edges of the map. I will go ahead and position myself near the tunnel. If anything looks suspicious, I will intervene. But unless it is necessary, you must act like a mother willing to sacrifice everything. I tightened my grip on the gun and nodded. I will act, and I will live. He did not answer. He simply looked at me with a strange expression, and for a brief moment I saw in his eyes something beyond concern, something deep and silent, like an apology he had carried for years. Perhaps he wished he could have saved Daniel, and now he wanted to save what remained. We left just before 11 that night. With the cabin lights off, Vincent drove through rocky paths dusted with old snow, the wind howling outside like a summons from a world I could no longer avoid. When we were about 2 miles from the warehouse, he stopped the car, opened the trunk, and handed me a heavy coat, a wool cap, and a small earpiece. You will wear this. I will be on the other end the whole time. If the signal drops for more than 3 minutes, I will come in. I slipped the earpiece in place, and pulled the coat tighter to hide the gun beneath the thick fabric. The cold wind cut across my cheeks, but I felt nothing. There was only focus now. Fear still lived inside me, but motherhood had pushed it down, and anger had settled into my bones, the kind of anger that grows from 5 long years of unanswered questions, of a love torn away, and of a child depending on me to return. I stepped into the darkness, my boots sinking softly into wet leaves and mud. The warehouse rose ahead like a sleeping beast, silent, its broken window spilling a thin line of light onto the ground. I reached the main door, my heart beat fierce in my chest. Before pushing it open, I touched the earpiece and whispered, "I am going in." Vincent's response came at once, firm and steady. "I hear you. Go." The door groaned as I pushed it, a long, wounded sound. Inside, the air was dusky and cold, filled with the scent of old wood and rusted machinery. Under the single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling, Franco stood waiting with his hands in his pockets, composed and expressionless, as though this were nothing more than an evening appointment. Behind him, in the corner, sat a wooden chair. Sophie was tied to it, her wrists bound, her mouth sealed with tape, her wide eyes locked on mine. "You arrived on time," Franco said, his voice identical to the one I had heard on the recording, smooth, unhurried, utterly without remorse. "Good. I despise lateness." I said nothing and stepped closer. Inside my sleeve, my fingers brushed the trigger. Every beat of my heart felt like a prayer. Every step I took was a vow. I had not come to negotiate. I had come to bring my daughter home. And I would do it, even if the cost was everything I had left. I kept my eyes locked on Franco as I stepped further into the freezing warehouse, the wooden floor beneath me groaning softly with every move, as if protesting each footfall. He stood motionless like a statue, his gray eyes calmly scanning me from head to toe. The air was thick with the scent of old oil, rusted metal, and something else I couldn't name, maybe the scent of fear, rising quietly from my chest. Sophie sat only about 5 steps away, her face pale, her eyes red from crying but still wide open, watching me as if she were holding back her tears just to spare me more worry. I looked at her and gave a faint smile, a signal that everything would be all right. But inside my mind, 100 worst-case scenarios reeled through, one after another. My hand stayed buried in my coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the gun Vincent had given me. I had never imagined myself holding a weapon, much less aiming it at another human being. But seeing my daughter tied to that chair, everything inside me shifted. Hesitation was replaced by something ancient and undeniable, a mother's instinct to protect, no matter the cost. Franco stepped forward once, slow and measured. "I do not want to hurt you or the child," he said, his voice smooth and polished, like a man proposing a business deal. "I only want what Daniel took. The USB drive. Hand it over and you can leave. Both of you." I didn't respond right away. I needed time. Vincent was still watching from the back, waiting for the right moment. I knew he would act when he had to. But I also knew that one wrong move could mean Sophie would be harmed. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a small box. Not the real USB, but the decoy Vincent had prepared earlier. I held it up in my open palm, suspended in the air. "This is what you want," I said slowly. "But I want to see my daughter freed first. I'm not leaving without her." Franco stared at me for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. He turned and gestured toward a tall man standing behind Sophie. That man stepped forward, peeled the tape from her mouth, but kept her hands bound. My breath caught in my throat. My grip on the gun tightened inside my coat. The tension was a wire pulled tight, and I knew that even the faintest noise could snap it. Just as the man stepped back, a small sound echoed from the far end of the warehouse, near a side door. Franco spun around and drew his gun from under his coat. I knew in that instant that Vincent had made his move. A shot rang. Out. I can't remember who fired first, but in the chaos of that moment, I saw Franco stagger to one side, and Vincent charging in from the back, firing at the 2 remaining men. I lunged toward Sophie, pulled a small knife from my boot, and cut the ropes around her wrists while Vincent kept firing to cover us. A bullet grazed my cheek, a searing heat like fire across my skin, but I didn't stop. I pulled Sophie into my arms. She sobbed against me, but didn't scream, holding it all in the way only a child raised in silence learns to do. Vincent was hit. I heard the sound of his body falling, a breath expelled so heavy it made my blood freeze. I turned and saw him slumped against a wooden beam, his hand pressed against his abdomen, blood soaking through his coat. Franco was still alive, trying to push himself upright, but Vincent raised his gun once more, his hands trembling but steady enough. "No more children," he said, and pulled the trigger. Franco collapsed, this time for good. I held Sophie close and dragged her toward Vincent. He looked up at me, lips pressed tight in pain. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I've had worse. The back exit. Go now. I'll follow." I pulled him up, wrapping his arm over my shoulder. Sophie clung to my other side, her small hand gripping mine with a strength I hadn't felt before. We moved through a narrow corridor leading to the hidden passage Vincent had told us about. Every step was a battle, but I didn't stop. I wasn't the same woman who once avoided pain, who once thought quiet was safety. I was Maggie. I was a mother. And I would bring my family out of this darkness, even if I had to walk through blood, through fire, and through every word left unspoken. The hallway leading toward the back of the warehouse was so narrow my shoulders nearly brushed both brick walls, and the flickering beam from the small flashlight I carried beat in rhythm with my own racing heart. Vincent moved slowly, each step heavier than the last. Sweat streamed down his forehead even though the world outside lay deep in winter. Blood seeped through the knit fabric of his sweater, marking a dark red trail along the side of his coat. I held his arm tighter, half lifting, half pulling him toward the door that would take us outside. Sophie walked close beside me, saying nothing, crying nothing, her small hand gripping mine as if she were clinging to a single rope above a raging sea. We turned into a narrow passage hidden behind an old furnace, a forgotten emergency tunnel built in the days of Vincent's father, now nothing but dust and broken stones. But to me, in this moment, it was the only road left toward life. When we finally pushed out into the thin edge of the woods where Vincent had hidden an old truck, I allowed myself a single trembling breath. The sky to the east had turned a pale silver gray. Dawn was near. Sophie shivered in the cold, and I slipped off my coat to wrap it around her shoulders, then helped her into the main back seat. I turned to lift Vincent, but he pushed my hands away. His face had gone ashen, his gaze dim, though the old resolve still flickered deep within it. "Do not let Sophie see me like this," he said between ragged breaths. "Take her. Go as far from here as you can." "No," I whispered, the words breaking in my throat. "I will not leave you. We came in together, and we leave together." Vincent caught my hand, his fingers icy yet still strong enough to halt me. "I have had a lifetime of chances to make amends, Maggie, but I managed only one thing right, helping you and Sophie survive. Let me hold on to that one right thing." Tears blurred my vision as I bent beside him. "You owe me nothing. Daniel forgave you long ago. You were not the one who pulled him into the dark. You were the last light he had left." Vincent gave a faint laugh, tinged with blood along his lips. If Daniel heard that, he would laugh just like I am now. He lifted his head a little, trying to look toward Sophie sitting quietly in the truck. "Tell her, her grandfather was once a terrible man. But he tried, he truly tried, to become someone her father would be proud of." Then he let go of my hand and leaned back against the truck door, closing his eyes as if drifting into a brief rest. I called his name and shook his shoulder, but Vincent did not answer. His breathing slowed, softened, then faded entirely, slipping away with the same quiet dignity that had marked so much of his life. He had lived in the shadows, walked behind everyone else, carried burdens no one ever saw, and now he left the world without complaint, without noise, exactly the way he believed he deserved. I sat quietly beside him for a few minutes, then wiped my tears and leaned down to kiss his forehead one last time. After that, I walked back toward Sophie, opened the truck door, and pulled her tightly into my arms. She looked up at me, her eyes still wide with fear. "Mom, is he?" I didn't answer right away. I just held her, letting her cry into my chest. Only after a long silence did I whisper, "He's the one who protected you, just like your father once did." We sat in the truck, the engine humming gently, warming the space between us. In the rearview mirror, I could see the warehouse fading into the distance, like a wound just stitched closed. Not healed, not yet, but enough to go on living. On the road home, my thoughts turned again and again to death and forgiveness. Daniel had forgiven his father in silence. Vincent had forgiven himself by choosing to lay down his life for ours. And me? I learned to forgive the past, to forgive myself for the years I spent running, for the things left unsaid, for the dreams that never had a chance to begin. Sophie had drifted off to sleep beside me, her small hand still wrapped tightly around mine. It felt like a promise not just that she trusted me, but that this world, as cruel as it could be, still held room for hope if we chose to. Hold on to each other. And in that soft light of dawn breaking ahead of us, I understood. The road behind us might have ended in blood and tears, but the road ahead would begin again with life, and love, and whatever fragile beauty could still be found in the ruins. Now, I sit at the window of a small wooden house on the outskirts of Chicago, my eyes following the backyard where fallen yellow leaves swirl gently in the first winds of winter. Sophie plays just beyond the porch with a stray cat we took in a few days ago, her laughter echoing softly into the stillness around us. Everything seems peaceful again, but inside me, there's a quiet storm that never really went away. Since we left Sterling, the nightmares have stopped, but I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, as if I've just escaped someplace far darker than sleep. The truth is, I don't really know where I am in my life anymore. Vincent didn't die. It felt like a miracle, after everything he had endured. When I pulled him from the warehouse floor, thinking it was over, he still had breath faint, but there, the hospital in the nearest town saved him, and during those long days while he lay unconscious, I never left his side. I cried when he opened his eyes for the first time, but I also felt something I couldn't name. Not just relief that he had survived, but fear, because somewhere deep in me, a quiet question had begun to form. If he lives, what happens now? I still loved Daniel, but my heart wasn't the same anymore. Not whole, not untouched, not unshaken by everything we had lived through. A few days after Vincent was discharged from the hospital, he came to see me while I was packing up the room. He stood on the porch, wearing an old knit sweater and a gray beanie, watching me with that quiet, unreadable look in his eyes. I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me, standing face to face with the man who had once been a stranger, then an unlikely ally, and eventually, a piece of memory I could no longer separate from myself. "You're really leaving?" Vincent asked, his voice rough, perhaps from antibiotics or too many sleepless nights. I nodded, smiling faintly. "I think Sophie needs a new beginning. A place where people don't look at me like I'm part of something bloody." Vincent nodded too, eyes dropping to the earth-stained shoes on his feet. "I understand. But I didn't come here just to say goodbye." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Daniel asked me to hold on to this. He wrote it a long time ago, when he first left you." I opened the envelope and found a letter written in black ink. Daniel's handwriting was so familiar it made my chest tighten the moment I saw it. I read it slowly, line by line, unable to hold back the tears. In the letter, Daniel spoke of the regret he carried for walking away, of how he had loved me from the very first day, and always believed that, someday, I would live the kind of life he could never give me. He apologized for leaving Sophie behind without being the father he had promised he would become. And then he wrote this: "If Vincent is still alive, give him a chance, not to replace me, but because he deserves to be loved again." I folded the letter gently and looked up at Vincent. He said nothing, only waited, as though every word Daniel had left behind was a plea he had no right to voice himself. I took a step closer, my voice trembling slightly. Do you think there could be another kind of life? One without shadows, without guns, without vengeance?" Vincent gave a quiet, sorrowful smile, his eyes deep and wind-worn like winter. "I don't know, but I do know that if anyone has the courage to begin again, it's you. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to go with you." I didn't answer right away. Part of me was still afraid. There were still doors inside me I hadn't dared to open. But another part, the part that had learned life never gives us the perfect moment to begin again, knew the only thing we could do was step forward, even with unsteady feet. I looked toward Sophie. She had turned around to glance at us, her small hand lifted in a quiet wave, as if sensing that something was about to change. I turned back to Vincent and took his hand. "We can try," I said. "No promises, but we can try." And for the first time in a long while, I saw in Vincent's eyes a light that wasn't duty or remorse. It was hope, a new kind of hope, born from the oldest parts of who we were. And I thought, maybe this is how second chances begin. Not with grand declarations, but with a quiet nod between two souls that had once fallen apart. The late December afternoon in Chicago was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that bites through your gloves and stings the tips of your fingers. The sky was ash gray, with not a single ray of sunlight, only snow, falling quietly like memories slowly descending upon my heart. Sophie and I stood before Daniel's grave. The headstone was simple, engraved with his name and the years of his birth and passing, yet it could never contain the fullness of what he left behind in this life. Beside us stood Vincent, thinner now after all that had happened, but his eyes still held that rare warmth, a kind of light found only in those who have walked through darkness and chosen to stay with the light. I placed a small photo on the stone, one taken of the three of us by the lake on a rare sunny day that autumn. It was the only time Daniel truly smiled during the brief chapter we had together. Sophie held a bouquet of white daisies. She laid them gently on the ground, then bowed her head in silence. The wind whipped through her hair, but she didn't move, as if she were trying to send her father all the things she never got to say. Vincent stood behind her, resting his hand on her shoulder. And in that, the moment, I understood something deep and clear. Family does not always begin with blood. Sometimes, it is built through choice, through compassion, and through those who have lost everything yet still choose to love again. I unfolded the final letter Daniel had ever written, the one Vincent had held on to all these years. In it, Daniel said that if I was reading these words, it meant he was no longer there to protect me, but he urged me not to live my life in regret. He hoped I would forgive the past, live fully in the present, and believe that there is still room in the future for something beautiful. He wrote that wherever he might be, he would always be watching over me and Sophie, like a small light in the night, not blinding, but enough to remind us we are never truly alone. The letter ended with 4 words that shattered me in the gentlest way. You deserve to be happy. I folded the letter carefully, then pulled Sophie and Vincent into a trembling embrace. That hug, beneath the cold Chicago wind, was not only a gesture among the living, it was for Daniel, for the things left unsaid, and for myself, for the woman who once believed she was too fragile, but somehow had crossed through hell holding on to the one thing that remained: love. As we left the cemetery, I looked back one last time. The wind carried a few white daisy petals into the air, and in that fleeting moment, I felt Daniel's presence not as a painful memory, but as something eternal and tender, forever rooted in my heart. Dear friends, life has a way of leading us down unexpected roads. It can scatter us in the blink of an eye, but what keeps us standing is love, forgiveness, and the belief that we are worthy of starting over. Maggie was once a single mother who knew only how to run. But in the end, she chose to face the past, to love, to forgive, and to live with intention. This story is not just a journey of escape from danger, but a journey of returning to one's true self. If you're watching this video and there have been moments when you felt like giving up, I hope Maggie's story gives you hope. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe, click like, and share this video to help spread its message. The Dear Single Mom channel is here for you every day, with heartfelt, meaningful, and real-life stories. How did you feel watching this story? Did any part of it remind you of your own life? Leave a comment below. We would love to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Wishing you strength, good health, and peace in every moment of your life. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next video on Dear Single Mom.